It's good to be with all of you here this afternoon. So happy to have this opportunity to share with you this day and be involved in several of the lectures, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you at this hour on the moral argument for the existence of God. Acts 17:16. While Paul waited for them in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he beheld the city full of idols. People, admittedly, with the one idol having this inscription to an unknown God, admitted they did not know God. And their worship, their idolatrous worship, revealed that they did not know God. People today, so many people do not know God. Even those that think they know about God don't know God. And our young people that are growing up in an ever unbelieving world don't know God either. Their professors are telling them that, as you know, they're apes, and yet their hearts are telling them something different. Their hearts are telling them that they're men and women, and there is a difference. Their professors are saying God is not real. Christians are delusional, and there's nothing after death. And so the college students, say, for example, and other young people, are being told nothing matters. There is no life after death. There is no God. There's certainly no such thing as sin. They're just the products of blind force, chance, and evolution. And so they want to know, well, why then do I hurt so bad? Why do I feel so bad? If nothing really matters and nothing is after this. They're just like the prolific atheist and hedonist Bertrand Russell, who wrote near the end of his life, "Through the long years I sought peace. I found ecstasy. I found anguish. I found madness. I found loneliness. I found solitary pain that gnaws the hearts, but peace I did not find." Suicide is a huge problem in our world today. According to the CDC, suicide is the third leading cause of death among the youth, more even than car accidents. Needless to say, young people and all people desperately need to know God. And our prayer is that the Lord will help us build a bridge, right, of reason. As if the width of this auditorium were a river of unbelief. Think about, over here are the banks of unbelief, and how can we build a bridge of reason so that our youth are able to cross that chasm of unbelief and find, as Paul would say, God who is not very far from any of us. One plank in that bridge of reason is what we're talking about this afternoon. The moral argument for the existence of God. We need to be sure that our young people understand the moral argument for the existence of God. Last May, my family and I walked through the gates of Sachsenhausen concentration camp. 21 miles north of Berlin. Through those same gates, 200,000 prisoners passed during the days leading up to and then during World War II. Fashioned in the ironwork of the concentration camp gates are these words: Arbeit macht frei. Work makes you free. The people that passed through those gates were nothing but free. Sachsenhausen was a Nazi concentration camp that was used primarily for political prisoners from 1936 to 1945. Unlike the death camps that we think about, like Auschwitz, those to the east, Sachsenhausen farmed out large numbers of prisoners for forced labor in the war effort. The Nazis created, by use of many of the prisoners, the largest counterfeiting ring of their war efforts. It was a functional model for other camps, and it was a training ground for SS guards, while not rivaling the systematic killings of the death camps that we're familiar with from history. Sachsenhausen dished out more than its fair share of unspeakable misery and murder. What was life like there? I don't even pretend to know or comprehend. But when we walk through those gates, what you immediately observe is a strange running track, like a walking track. And it had different types of surfaces throughout its circuit. This was a walking or running track where prisoners would be forced to march or run from 16 to 24 miles a day. So bootmakers could test their boots. Sometimes the prisoners were given boots that were too small, just because. Medical experimentation took place on unwilling prisoners. Some were given drug cocktails with substances like cocaine, methamphetamines, and oxycodone. Allegedly, the Nazis sought to develop some type of performance-enhancing drug for frontline soldiers. You could imagine what people experienced in a context like that. Barracks were overcrowded, which naturally meant that those people who were sick, or elderly, or weak, or timid ended up on the floor, sleeping on the floor in human waste. If prisoners got too close to the concentration camp wall, they were cut down by machine gun fire. Those trying to escape were hung to death in a public hanging, and every prisoner was forced in single file to walk up and look at that dead person in the face. Thousands were shot in the back of the head while they thought they were being measured for uniforms in an office. Of course, fellow prisoners were forced to stack corpses like cordwood onto carts. Within the camp, on the right-hand side, there was a wall that was like a prison within a prison. And so those who were housed in that interior part of the camp were separated from the general population. So those prisoners in the general population, they couldn't see. What is that all about? What's going on over there? But those prisoners were treated with extraordinary cruelty inside a solitary unit. Their hands would be tied behind their backs, and then they would be suspended from poles by their hands behind their backs. And so what the people in the general population could do is they could hear what was going on, but never see it. And so by that kind of brutal psychology, the Nazis were saying, just when you think it's bad for you, there's always somewhere worse. Of course, we unfortunately could see the remnants of the gas chambers that were there, the crematorium. In reality, at the end of the tour, which is not by any means a pleasure cruise, it's too much to take in. Near the end of our tour of Sachsenhausen, one of my daughters particularly had seen enough. She was overwhelmed. Put her face into her hands and just sobbed. How could anyone treat another human being like that? In the museum, there was a section of a wall where there were little small clipboards so that visitors to the museum could write notes or express thoughts about their experience of visiting the camp. One visitor had written this: where was God? It's a fair question. It's a real question. And people are asking questions just like that, not only of what horrific things have happened in the past, but the things they see in their own lives. The injustices and the suffering experienced. Now, Bart Ehrman is a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's an atheist, and he searches for a rationale for all of these things, as people want to do. And as he does that, however, from an atheistic point of view, and as one of the militant, aggressive, ridiculing type of individuals, he distorts Scripture and rails upon people who believe in God in view of all of these kinds of injustices and pain and suffering. His book, God's Problem: How the Bible Fails to Answer Our Most Important Question, Why We Suffer, expresses his view that this is inexplicable. It is incompatible, all of this suffering, with the belief in an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God. And so he claims to know, that he knows everything enough to draw this conclusion. I just want to read you a short quote and ask you, does anything strike you about this from an atheist? He's talking about the other books that people write. The other books that try to give some point of view from a believer, from a Christian point of view, in terms of reconciling what we believe about God with what we see in the world. He says, in my opinion, though, many of these books are either intellectually unsatisfying, morally bankrupt, or practically useless. He continues, other books are morally dubious, especially those written by intellectual theologians or philosophers. He then goes on to say that he finds these books morally repugnant. There's a little bit of irony in that, right? An atheist talking about how offended, morally offended he is. If there is no God, nothing is objectively evil. If there is no God, it's just your opinion. And the Nazis had their opinion. And if there is no God, who is anybody to say that was wrong? You're just expressing your opinion. If there is no God, why does it matter? If there is no God, how can I say that something is objectively evil or a book is morally repugnant? It's just my opinion. So here's what we want to affirm today. If there is no God, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. That is, there's no way to evaluate something objectively without an objective standard. There's no way to settle disputes against two opposing parties on a moral issue of right and wrong. There's no way to settle that without an objective moral standard. So if there is no God, then behavior is just biological functions. It's a matter of social constructs. It's just, it's just who we are. So if a society says that they feel that they need to exterminate a hostile element within their society, who is to say that's wrong if there is no God? As the infamous Dawkins wrote in his book, River Out of Eden, A Darwinian View of Life, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to just get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we would expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil or good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is. Well, like a broken clock that's right at least, twice a day. If Mr. Dawkins writes long enough, he's going to say something right. And he's right. If there is no God, there is no good or evil. There is no objective moral standard. Yet even atheists cannot bear the consequences of that kind of idea. They continue themselves to search for some moral foundation to explain it. Why? Because it's patently absurd to deny morality, that it exists. Of course, moral values and duties exist, and the pressure to explain that on atheists and their pitiful attempts to do that in a naturalistic way are in and of themselves unwitting concessions to the argument we're making today. The existence of objective morality points to an objective moral lawmaker. Now, just for a minute, we'll focus, by way of a side note, on this idea. Well, where does it come from? This moral feeling, moral oughtness, and obligation. Well, the atheists will affirm that, this is just kind of the herd morality. This developed, on the plains, and, our knuckle-dragging ancestors learned to get along, to survive, and so this is just how this came about. It's just for the good of the survival of the species, and so it became a very natural thing to do. This is in part how Sam Harris tries to explain with science the existence of morality. But again, I point to this fact: they cannot deny that morality exists. But no real natural explanation exists for what we're describing as objective moral values and duties. What do we mean by that? We mean that there are matters that are independent of human judgment. There are things that are wrong or right for everyone, everywhere, at any time. So it doesn't matter what we think. It doesn't matter how someone feels. Here is a matter that in and of itself is good or evil. So here's this explanation, the herd mentality. I want to respond, what herd? I mean, it's not like the human race is just a herd that wants to help everyone else. In fact, the analogy from nature is this. Here's one herd, and they're working together wonderfully. It's called a pride of lions, and they want to eat someone's baby. So not all herds are exactly on good terms. There is no analogy in nature for what we see in us. There is no explanation to cry for people whom you've never met, who died almost 100 years ago. But that's exactly how people live. Let's consider the nature of moral values and duties. Here's a beautiful passage from the Apostle Paul in Romans 2:14 and 15. For when Gentiles that have not the law, what does that mean? They don't have the scriptures where, like the Ten Commandments, spelled out, thou shalt not. They don't have the written revelation, but they do by nature the things of the law. They do what? They do by nature. The first thing we're going to talk about is that human beings understand moral prescriptions. So we'll come back to that. But then Paul goes on to say that these not having the law, this then awareness or this moral oughtness by nature, he says, this becomes a law unto themselves. They recognize this as binding on them. So in this, they show that the law is written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness therewith, and their thoughts, one with another, accusing or else excusing them. The second thing we'll talk about are moral judgments. Okay, moral prescriptions and moral judgments. That is, even before something happens, we talk about what ought to be. And after something happens, we evaluate. Those are two different things, and let's talk about them for a minute. People recognize the existence of moral oughts, or what we're calling moral prescriptions. That as human beings have a sense of what ought to be done or what ought not to be done as they contemplate future events, decisions. We talk about we should fill in the blank. We should feed the hungry. We should clothe the poor. We should protect our children. We should make our schools safer. We should provide for good education. We should respond to the opioid crisis. We should fight against human trafficking. We should. There is an awareness to look into our world, to evaluate matters that have even not happened or need to happen, and we say, this is what we should do. Furthermore, we say things like murder is wrong, child abuse is wrong, children ought never to be abused in any way by anybody. Is that just my opinion? Or does everyone recognize that's the way it ought to be? What if somebody does not share that value? There are people that don't. We say that ought not to be. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, the United Nations held the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And so shortly thereafter, it became a crime under international law to commit, conspire, incite, or even be complicit in genocide. That it was a crime. Well, what was it before the law was passed? For somebody to decide that here's a whole group of people that should be exterminated. There was no international law. What law did the Nazis break? Wasn't the law of England, wasn't the law of France, it didn't apply. What law did they break? They broke the law that is binding on every man and woman, independent of human opinion. They broke the moral law that is so self-evident and obvious in the hearts of people everywhere that it virtually requires no defense to say this law exists. Never again is the motto that comes out of that time. And no normal human being can look at these kinds of atrocities and say, and expect to be taken seriously, that there is no evil and no good, but blind, pitiless indifference, unless they've abandoned reason and decided to join a cult. Right? The Church of Philosophical Atheism. Of course, we recognize moral prescriptions. If you go to the pharmacy to have a prescription filled, and the pharmacist says, "Who wrote that prescription?" And you say, "Nobody, it just appeared." And he will say to you, "Whatever you've been taking, you need to stop it." Because that doesn't make sense. If there is a prescription, there is a prescriber. If there is a law, there is a lawmaker. And so, you and I know, and we experience the world on this level, that regardless of whatever explanations are offered, they're absurd. Objective moral law exists. It certainly does. Notice how easy it is to really get a hold of this, you might say, in an everyday level. And what I mean is, pay attention, especially not to what people do. I'm talking about the recognition of moral oughtness, right? Don't pay attention so much to what people do, but what they don't want done to them. Now you'll really see what they're made of. They've got a sense of what's right and wrong, of where the boundaries are. You know, the atheist doesn't believe in God. He doesn't accept the moral precepts within the 10 Commandments, but he sure hopes his neighbor does. Right? What kinds of things does an atheist expect from his neighbor? If his neighbor is kind and compassionate and honest, does that offend him? If the atheist has a death in his family and the neighbor expresses sympathy, does that make him angry? What about the atheist who's sitting at his little breakfast nook one morning, reading the newspaper, having his cup of coffee or latte or cappuccino or whatever? He looks out the window, and there is the neighbor again, walking his rather large dog over to his lawn for business. Tired of this daily and considerate routine, the atheist steps out on his porch with a look of unbelief, turns his palms upward, shrugs his shoulders, gesturing for some kind of explanation. The neighbor sees, he's looking at me, what's going on here? And he simply points to the dog and said, "Sorry, it's evolution." Back in the day, people, they went somewhere else to do such things, not in their own abode or cave. So I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. I don't suspect he will abide by that. He will say, "This is not right. This is my property. And you don't have a right to my property to use as you see fit." Seriously, the atheist expects his neighbor that he shout, not kill. He expects his neighbor shout, not steal. He expects his neighbor shout, not commit adultery, and shall not lie about him. He expects all of that. Why? Because it's written on the heart. Every man and woman, every human being, regardless of those that suppress it, regardless of those that don't act consistent with it, reveal it when something bad happens to them. Let's turn the page and ask another question. What happens when people break moral law? How do people feel about that? There is this recognition of moral oughtness, but what about when things happen that ought not? Think about how people respond and how they talk about this. They look at what has happened in the world and say, "That's not right." They look at what happens to them and say, "That's not right." They even look at themselves sometimes and say, "What? I should not have done that." We're now talking about moral judgments. That just like we can't help but to recognize how things ought to be, we can't help rendering a moral verdict on people's behavior. We look at it and we judge it because it's written on our hearts. Paul says the conscience bears witness with what the heart has written on it. In other words, after the fact, the conscience will render an irrevocable verdict, either accusing or excusing. What happened on February 14th, 2018 in Parkland, Florida? What happened? Does anybody have a judgment about that? Or are you neutral? Would you say that the murder of 17 children you find distasteful as a matter of your opinion? Would you say that something needs to be done? You cannot help but to see evil and make a moral judgment. Do we have any moral foundation to say that this is wrong? To make such a judgment? That anywhere, anytime, it is wrong to murder innocent children? Or is there a moral difference between Nicholas Cruz, who killed all of those people, and Aaron Feist, the man who put himself in front of children and died protecting them? Is there any difference between those two men? You know there is. We make these kinds of moral distinctions or judgments, and this in and of itself is evidence that morality is an objective matter. It cannot be relegated to the level of opinion, nor is there any kind of so-called natural explanation. Think about this for a minute. You and I, morally sensitive people, are horrified at things like this. But in reality, let's be scientific. School shootings do not threaten the species. There's still 7.4 billion people in the world. Why care about one child? It's because that child has intrinsic worth. Unlike Dawkins, who says there's nothing but pitiless indifference, why can we not feel indifferent? We cannot feel indifferent because we are people of moral feeling and obligation, and when things happen, we make instantaneous moral judgments. Consider then our argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. But clearly, undeniably, objective moral values and duties do exist. And we know it. Therefore, God exists. No explanation, no atheistic explanation can tell us why we think and feel that way. So we're trying to build a bridge. We're trying to build a bridge of reason to say to people who are not going to respond initially to Scripture, we're saying, think about this. Think about yourself. It's written on the heart. The moral law in our world, in our being, that is at the very core of who we are, is undeniable. And if there is such a moral law, there's a moral law maker. I like what Will Allen Dromgoole wrote in The Bridge Builder. He said, "An old man going a lone highway came at evening, cold and gray, to a chasm vast and deep and wide, through which was flowing a sullen tide. The old man crossed in the twilight dim. The solemn stream had no fear for him, but he turned when safe on the other side and built a bridge to span the tide. 'Old man,' said a fellow pilgrim near, 'you're wasting your strength building here. Your journey will end with the end of the day. You never again will pass this way. You've crossed the chasm deep and wide. Why build you this bridge at eventide?' The builder lifted his old gray head. 'Good friend, in the path I have come,' he said, 'there followed after me today a youth whose feet must pass this way. This chasm that has been naught to me, to that fair-haired youth may a pitfall be. He too must cross in the twilight dim. Good friend, I'm building this bridge for him.' You and I have our feet planted firmly on the banks of faith and trust in God. There's still some folks on the other side. May we build the bridge of reason to span across that chasm of unbelief. Thank you so much for your kindness and for being here today, for your interest in these matters. I deeply appreciate your attention.